On the 25th of August this year, the stock market in Shanghai fell by 8.5%. This, what is now being widely referred to as Black Monday, was the biggest one-day drop in China since 2007 and echoed everywhere. Stock markets around the world plunged amid fears that China's economic growth was faltering, terror reverberating violently across economies that have become increasingly reliant on China's demand for imports. Citing a specialist economic measure, the Financial Times reported, in a moment of strange, bleak poetry, that the VIX index of implied volatility suggested fear at late 2008 levels, although, it reassured, it subsided quickly. And indeed, by the end of the week, Katie Allen, in her article for The Guardian about what it will mean for the UK, said that the stock markets in Europe had regained their Black Monday losses. She has to admit, however, that it's too soon to tell if China's wobble will spark a new global downturn. This, for the financial class, is a nightmare scenario. In terms of global impact, an article titled "Taking a Tumble" in The Economist noted, a hard landing in China would now rival an American depression. The country's recent and extended period of growth has made it voracious for the commodities of expansion, commodities the rest of the world has been only too delighted to supply. As The Economist goes on, countries from Australia to Angola have grown richer from digging stuff out of the ground and shipping it to China. Industries from car making to luxury goods look to China for new business. It has been the most stable contributor to world economic growth. This is not the first time rumours about China's impending crisis have made the news. Having hit a 7-year peak in mid-June, The Guardian, in their explainer about why the stock market was in crisis, reported that a 3-week plunge shaved an extraordinary 30% off share prices by July. The Japan Times reports in its article, "China Grapples with Risk of Economic Hard Landing," that the authorities have spent an estimated $234 billion on buying shares to try to support prices after a nearly 40% collapse in the stock market since mid-June. An increasing number of commentators have been raising the alarm as China's economy has finally started to slow. In both cause and consequence, the country's government is attempting to shift its economic growth from its long-standing reliance on investment towards a more service-based economy fueled by consumption. And since China is the world's second-largest economy after the United States, as the Huffington Post reports understatedly, even modest declines can have a significant negative impact on economies across the world. So were Black Monday and its quieter predecessor just a couple of momentary blips in China's otherwise impressive economic record of the last few years? Or is the Financial Times correct to argue, as it does in the title of one article, that China's crisis is coming, the only question is how big it will be? Are we witnessing signs, as the FT goes on, of a severe collapse that will become unavoidable within a few years? UK Chancellor George Osborne certainly doesn't seem to think so. During his recent trip to China, he has made strenuous efforts to shore up the solid links between the UK and Chinese economies, as The Economist reported, hailing, among other agreements, the forthcoming issuance of yuan-dominated bonds in London, new licences for British banks operating in China, and a guarantee for up to £2 billion, $3 billion, of Chinese investment in Hinkley Point, a nuclear power station in Somerset. Other observers, however, like Mike Bird in the Business Insider, are not so sure of the strategy. Osborne might look pretty clever in a few years, or he might come to regret making a bet on China. In his article, "British banks are far more exposed to China's economic quagmire than any of their competitors," Bird goes on to make the persuasive case that Osborne is getting behind the Chinese economy with such enthusiasm, at least in part because the UK economy is so uniquely imbricated with China's. The Financial Times hailed a golden decade in Sino-British relations and reported that Britain's foreign direct investment flow from China of $11.8 billion was the highest in Europe. Indeed, and to put that in astonishing perspective, as Mike Bird does, UK banks have more exposure to China than those in the euro area, US and Japan combined. With the Chinese president's visit to the UK, the Wall Street Journal suggests that China sees President Xi's visit as a chance to build on his efforts during a US trip last month to showcase the commercial opportunities presented by China's rise, while playing down concerns over its military power, human rights record and economic outlook. It notes the difference in approach between the UK and the US. The Financial Times certainly suspects that there will be damage. It says US-UK ties suffered in March when the Obama administration lambasted Britain's constant accommodation of China. In its article, "David Cameron Dismisses Risk of Rift with US Over China," The Guardian reported, the Prime Minister said, "We see no conflict with having that very special relationship with wanting to be a strong partner for China as the Chinese economy continues to grow and China emerges as an enormous world power. So is Osborne crazy, or crazy like a fox? That remains to be seen. But underlining the point that even a Chinese slowdown still represents the kind of numbers that other countries can only envy, The Guardian wrote a handy explainer: it's not the Chinese economy that's on life support. They pointed out that the growing importance of the Chinese economy for the health of the global economy is illustrated by the fact that America's GDP has grown by just over 10% since 2008, while over the same period China's has increased by about 66%. So just how bad are the signs? The media are split on the question of what is to come, and on how bad it will be, both for China and for the rest of the world. On the one side, The Economist reports, the Chinese government has thrown at least $156 billion at buying shares in order to stabilise them, only to see prices plunge even more violently. The fear is that all this market turmoil speaks to deeper fractures in the foundations of the Chinese economy, with the entire edifice at risk of toppling over. And, underlining how alarming all this should be for those outside of China, the article stresses that any ensuing crisis will be inevitably global. A decline in Chinese consumption would be of huge consequence. It absorbs about half of the world's aluminium, nickel and steel, and nearly a third of its cotton and rice. This reflects the role that China's economy played in the post-2008 years. As Martin Jakes points out in The Guardian, when the Western economies were on their knees in 2007 and 2008, the Chinese economy rode to the rescue. Although the actions of the Beijing government were primarily motivated by self-interest, avoiding being dragged down by the crisis, they also had the effect of saving the Western economies from a fate far worse. The Wall Street Journal does not disagree, as its article, China's Stock Plunge is Scarier Than Greece, lays bare. If Beijing can't stop the market's tumble, there could be a sudden shift in the perception of exactly how far economic growth might fall under the weight of too much debt. If that floor crumbles and the Chinese economy spirals downwards, it will make the drama surrounding Greece feel like a sideshow. But, in quite the opposite direction, the Australian Financial Review's article, Why China Isn't Having the Crisis Some Would Have You Believe, argues that the world economy is not on the brink of a Chinese-induced relapse. On the contrary, as lower commodity and oil prices work their way through the system, in the US and the UK at least, we will see consumer spending rising and the economic recovery strengthening. Joining them in optimism is the New York Times in its article, False Alarm on a Crisis in China, which suggests that, rather than a financial and economic meltdown, China is experiencing an overdue correction in its equity market, and the connection between China's equity market and China's real economy has always been tenuous. It does not deny that the markets indicate alarm, nor does it rule out the possibility of a further share sell-off, but suggests that recent events should be seen as part of the conscious liberalisation and rebalancing of the Chinese economy. Even if that means a sell-off in stocks, it's not a sell-off in the fundamentals of the Chinese economy. So who should we believe? Those suggesting there is nothing to worry about place all their faith in the markets to rebalance the economy, as the New York Times openly declares. Allowing those corrections to take place is part of letting markets determine outcomes, which is a good thing. On the other hand, those pointing to slowing growth rates, falling commodity demand and faltering stock markets make a compelling point. Given the level of denial about the state of Lehman Brothers, the consequences of its collapse, and the ensuing crisis, it is wise to be sceptical of assurances that finance knows what it is doing, that markets determine the best outcomes, and that the economy can take it. China is indeed attempting to steer its economy in a new direction. Its investment-based economy of the recent years resulted in $586 billion of stimulus program being poured into its economy to boost domestic demand and offset the loss in demand for Chinese exports following the last global economic crisis. But, as the Financial Times pointed out, China's first recourse has been to unleash credit, such as by leaning on local authorities to splurge on infrastructure or property, but decades of this has strewn debt across the land, much through 10,000 local government financing vehicles, LGFVs, which have total liabilities exceeding 40% of gross domestic product. This action has resulted in stable growth for the past 35 years. And most commentators agree that China's strategy of increasing social spending in order to spur its economy towards importing commodities to fuel infrastructure played a large part in preventing a more prolonged global economic crisis, which is precisely why so many China watchers are now worried that this stability looks set to weaken. The world's number 2 economy now finds itself with an insoluble dilemma, as the Financial Times lays out. Exports can no longer be the country's saviour. Representing some 15% of the global economy, China is too large to trade its way to glory. Nor would it be wise to revert to the investment-led model that has powered the economy since the financial crisis. Such high levels of capital investment are both an inefficient model of development and one inevitably prone to sudden stops. The danger for China, and thus all of us, is less that the country has to work out the correct of two choices, but that it is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. Certainly the stock markets are skittish and are losing their faith in the Chinese government's ability to reach its stated aim of a 7.5% growth this year. Some observers believe they may reach 7%, others, such as Roger Bootle in the Australian Financial Review, have them groping for between 4% and 5%. When dealing with an economy of such vastness, being 3% out is to fall short by inconceivable sums, with potentially devastating effects. Grow, stagnate, or crash, China will shape, and very likely shake, the global economy for a long time to come. No one can predict with absolute certainty whether or how soon a crisis is coming in China, but the signs are not good.